Russian President Vladimir Putin has arrived in Uzbekistan, where he's due to meet with his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping. It'll take place on the sidelines of a summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation in the ancient Silk Road city of Samarkand. Now, the summit will focus on regional security issues and is being touted as a challenge to Western global influence. It'll be the first meeting between the Russian and Chinese leaders since Russia invaded Ukraine.
The last time Chinese President Xi Jinping met Russian President Vladimir Putin in Beijing, he declared there were no limits to the friendship between the two superpowers. That was just days before Russia invaded Ukraine. Since then, Beijing has been largely silent about the Kremlin's war against its neighbor, other than saying that China supports peace talks. Russia and China have also been making their deepening partnership plain to see for the rest of the world by conducting joint military exercises on land, air, and sea. China, for its part, can count on Russia's staying out of what it sees as its domestic affairs, most importantly tensions over Taiwan, which Beijing regards as a breakaway province. Beijing has been stepping up its military activities around the island in response to recent high-profile visits to Taiwan by senior U.S. lawmakers. China continues to play an important indirect role in financing the Kremlin's war machine by supporting Russia's economy with increased energy imports. While Russia has lost markets in the West, trade with China has soared by a third this year. China has said Presidents Xi and Putin are working together to shape what Beijing calls a more just world order.
Let's look at this with Andrew Small. He's a China expert and a senior transatlantic fellow with the Asia Programme at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome to DW. As we mentioned, this is President Xi's first trip outside China since the pandemic. Does that mean he regards this summit as particularly important?
Well, the decisions about these trips are always extremely symbolic. He could have made this a virtual summit if he'd wanted to. Instead, it means he can do a kind of comfort zone multilateralism almost ahead of the party Congress. It gives him a chance to see some of China's closest partners, especially Putin, of course, with whom really these meetings have always been a priority since the very beginning of his time as party secretary. And it means he can put on this strong show of a non-Western gathering, counterpoint to G7, to NATO, at an organization, the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation, that's of China's own creation. I think Xi at the moment wants to show that in this struggle with the United States, in the struggle with the West, that China has friends too, and then it can put on a kind of visible show of that.
Right, I'm going to have that expression put on a mug, I think. Comfort zone multilateralism. In February, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the two leaders declared there were no limits to their partnership. China also, as you say, hasn't condemned Russia's invasion. So is Beijing's support for Moscow unconditional?
Well, political support, yes. Diplomatic, propaganda, as we've seen, and as you mentioned in the segment, some forms of economic support too, the natural resource purchases, but also helping Russia navigate some of the financial constraints that US sanctions have imposed. I think there are other areas, there's forms of military support that China will be warier about, even certain arms supplies. This isn't really material to the conflict. And there are forms of sanctions support as well, where I think China certainly doesn't want to impose costs on its own companies, where it's still quite dependent on Western technology and the Western financial system. But it's certainly unconditional support in the sense that it doesn't really matter what Russia does. China doesn't react to stories of Russian atrocities or, as you mentioned in the story, attacks on civilian infrastructure. There's just indifference to the actual conduct of the war. And I think they want to show that they will continue to give solidarity, even if, as we see at the moment, the Russian campaign is failing. So in that sense, I think that there are significantly unconditional elements to the forms of support that China provides.
Right, and just talking about this idea that the Russian war effort is failing. The two countries have conducted joint military exercises this year. Is Russia's apparent failure in Ukraine causing China perhaps to rethink their military relationship?
Well, I mean, China had always been very impressed with the Russian military operations, particularly in Crimea and in Syria, and they sort of hoped and expected that Moscow would be able to pull off something, I think, similar this time. So they were surprised that this was such a failure. They'll have been conducting their assessments on what went wrong. I think the sense had been that Russia is good at the kind of lightning-type operations and less good at the longer attritional ones. And I think that will certainly be reinforced. But I think the biggest concern on the Chinese side with this will be what it might do to Russia's global capabilities. That no limits agreement in February that you mentioned was very much about the two sides working together in third regions, including militarily, and we've seen that to a certain extent even in recent months in Asia, but also the Middle East, in Africa. I think the concern China will have is whether Russia's capabilities have been and still are being worn down by this war, and therefore what level of cooperation is likely to be able to sustain as a result of that. But I don't think it's a trust question. It's more a concern about what this is going to do to the Russian military.
Well, that's very clear. Thank you so much for outlining that for us. Andrew Small from the German Marshall Fund of the United States.
Thank you.
Well, DW's Moscow bureau is now operating from the Latvian capital Riga, and bureau chief Yuri Richardo joins us from there. Welcome, Yuri. What's expected to come out of this meeting?
Well, this meeting is important because it will be the first time, Phil, both have made such a major public appearance outside their countries since February. Xi hadn't even traveled abroad since the pandemic started. It is hard to say exactly what the two will discuss, but of all the participants in Uzbekistan, probably only Xi and Turkey's President Erdogan, whom Putin is also scheduled to meet, can ask the Russian president to end the war. Since the start of the war, China has stood firmly by Russia's side. China hasn't condemned Russia's so-called special military operation, and China also hasn't joined Western sanctions against Russia.
And with Russia facing international sanctions because of the war in Ukraine, its relationship with China must be increasingly important.
Absolutely. China hasn't only been important for Russia since February 24th, but already since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea. Already back then, there was suddenly a big rift in relations between Moscow and the West, and that was the moment when Russia recognized the importance of China for itself. Now, China is supposed to compensate economically for everything that the Russians are suddenly missing because of the impact of Western sanctions. Militarily, there was an obvious closing of ranks the other day during joint military exercises in Russia's Far East. We saw it in the report. The Chinese participated in them this year and have been a regular guest at Russian military exercises for some time already. When it comes to foreign policy, it is extremely important for Putin to show that he isn't isolated worldwide. So for this reason, China is super important for the Russians.
Right, and on that point of isolation, I guess this conference, the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation, this is another opportunity for the Russian leaders to show that he has international friends.
Absolutely. Every appearance on the international stage is very important for Putin, as it shows that the Russian president isn't isolated. In this respect, this conference is also being generously exploited for propaganda purposes in Russia. Nevertheless, Putin's trip to Uzbekistan cannot improve the difficult situation on the front in Ukraine and consequently reduce the pressure that is growing on Putin in his own country.
Okay, thank you for that, Yuri. Yuri Richardo in Riga.